Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world full of smoke, sizzle, and the occasional mysterious smell wafting through the streets. Welcome to the medieval marketplace, where the sound of clanging pots and the buzz of bustling crowds filled the air. Street food, though a little rough around the edges, was the heartbeat of urban life during the Dark Ages. You probably won't survive a meal without a solid stomach, or maybe just the strong will to survive the street side experience. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the local time too. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, let's kick things off with a big question. What did medieval people snack on? Now, we're not talking about the fancy medieval feasts served in castles, the ones with roasted boar and golden goblets of wine, though we wish. This story is about what the common folk nibbled on during their busy, sometimes tough days. Stuff you could grab while strolling through the market or wandering the town square. These snacks were often simple, but oh, were they satisfying. For many, these quick bites weren't just a treat, they were a lifeline. Back then, you couldn't just pop into a convenience store or a fast food joint. If you wanted something to munch on, you had to find it in the marketplace or on the street, often from a vendor who might have a bit more to offer than just food. For centuries, the medieval street food scene was a blend of the practical and the curious, a real reflection of the times. Street food, however, wasn't exactly as we imagine it today. There were no food trucks or Instagram influencers showing off street food hacks. Instead, the medieval snack scene was alive with the smells of roasted meats, bubbling pots of pottage, and the occasional sugary treat that would satisfy a sweet tooth after a long day of work. But what exactly was on the menu? Before we get into the specifics, let's remember that medieval street food was not for the faint of heart. The food was often cooked in the open, exposed to the elements, and sometimes made with ingredients that could raise eyebrows. But hey, when you're hungry, a little mystery can be part of the thrill, right? Let's dive into the first aspect of medieval street food, the rise of public markets and street vendors. Back in the day, towns and cities were growing rapidly, and with that came the need for food vendors to keep up with the ever-growing population. These markets became the hotspots for the quick bites that were a part of everyday life. They weren't just about food, they were the center of social life too. People gathered here not only to shop, but to interact, trade gossip, and share news. Food and social life went hand in hand. The concept of street food as we know it wasn't as formalized back then, but it served the same function. Imagine this. You're walking down a crowded medieval street with the hustle and bustle around you. People are shouting, bargaining, and laughing while you pass by a vendor with a sizzling spit of meat turning over a flame. The smell of roasted mutton or pork wafts through the air, making your stomach growl. You don't have time to sit down at a table, but hey, this vendor has a snack that'll hold you over until dinner. Street food in medieval times was as much about convenience as it was about flavor. It was meant to be quick, easy, and portable. The people who worked hard all day, peasants, tradespeople, and artisans, needed food that could be eaten on the go. This was pre-fork and knife days, so grabbing something with your hands and gobbling it down was a way of life. The snacks on offer often reflected the society they were a part of. Simple, hearty, and satisfying. But the medieval snack scene wasn't just all about bread and meat. In fact, the streets were alive with all kinds of flavors, textures, and even the unexpected. You may think of the Middle Ages as a time when food was dull and monotonous, but you'd be wrong. Some of the most unusual and interesting snacks came from the street vendors who'd mix and match what was available to create something unique. The medieval street food scene was its own little culinary experiment. Think about how food stalls today use whatever's in season. Medieval vendors were no different. The seasonal aspect of medieval street food meant that certain things were only available during specific times of the year. In the spring, you might have found fresh fruits or berries being sold on the streets, while autumn would bring roasted nuts and hearty stews. This was a reflection of medieval farming traditions, where what grew in the ground determined the flavor of the season. You could even think of the vendors as early food innovators. Much like how trucks today get creative with what they have on hand. Medieval street food vendors were constantly adapting to the market's changing tastes. While the food may have been simple, the presentation and the experience of grabbing something quick from the vendor were what made it so memorable. Now that we've set the scene, let's look a little deeper into the origins of medieval street food and how it became a vital part of everyday life. To truly understand street food in the Dark Ages, we need to look at the rise of public markets and how these bustling hubs became the birthplace of street food culture. Back in the medieval period, urbanization was slowly but surely transforming Europe. As towns grew, so did the need for trade. Markets became the central point of commerce, where everything from cloth to livestock was sold. But food vendors weren't just peddling the basics. They were creating an entirely new culinary culture on the streets. With a growing number of people living in cities and towns, finding a quick bite was essential. No one had the luxury of sitting down for a long, drawn-out meal every day. There were jobs to be done, trades to be made, and, most importantly, markets to visit. Medieval cities often had designated market days where vendors would set up stalls, creating a sea of options for hungry townsfolk. Some of these markets were permanent fixtures in the town squares, others popped up on specific days of the week, and some even became the focal point of festivals. Either way, if you were in the mood for a quick bite, it was there for the taking. Interestingly, these early public markets weren't just about food. They were a convergence of social, economic, and political activity. Picture it: the clatter of wooden carts, the hum of conversations, the occasional shout of a vendor hawking their wares. Street food vendors had to be both chefs and performers. Their ability to draw a crowd and sell their goods often came down to how well they could engage with passers-by. What's fascinating is that medieval street food wasn't limited to just a few simple options. While we think of street food today as being trendy and varied, the medieval world had a variety of snacks to satisfy different tastes and needs. What's more, these snacks often had cultural significance, tied to local customs, festivals, and even religious practices. For instance, during Lent, when meat was forbidden, vendors turned to fish, legumes, and bread-based snacks to keep people fed without breaking the rules. But let's get to the real heart of the medieval street food scene: the meat vendors. Imagine walking down a busy medieval street and suddenly catching a whiff of roasted meat turning on a spit. In an age when refrigeration was unheard of and fresh food was a rare commodity, the scent of meat roasting over an open flame was a luxury for many. But despite the lack of modern preservation techniques, the medieval world was all about the meat, and street vendors were the go-to place for this primal food experience. Now, we're not just talking about the fancy cuts of beef or lamb that you might find in a modern steakhouse. Oh no, medieval street food was much more diverse. You could get anything from lamb, beef, and pork to more unusual meats like venison, or even something more exotic like wild boar. Historians still argue whether all of these meats were as fresh as the vendors claimed, considering the lack of proper refrigeration, but one thing's for sure: the sizzling sound of meat on the spit was part of the medieval street food allure. And the meat wasn't always the centerpiece. While roasted meat on a stick might seem like the ultimate medieval snack, there were plenty of other foods to choose from. Bread, for example, was another central feature in the street food world. Think about it. You couldn't eat meat without something to wash it down, and bread was the perfect companion. Medieval bread came in all shapes and sizes: dense loaves, flatbreads, and even bread bowls, which would often be used to hold pottage or stew, two other staples of the medieval street food scene. Speaking of pottage, it's time to talk about what peasants ate. And I'm not talking about some refined 5-course meal. No, we're talking about the staple of the medieval working class: pottage. Pottage was basically a thick, hearty stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, or meats the cook had on hand. You could eat it with bread, pour it over bread, or eat it directly out of the pot, depending on the recipe. It was the go-to for anyone working in the fields or on the streets, filling people up without being too expensive or difficult to prepare. What's funny is that pottage wasn't always a crowd pleaser. For some, it was a comforting, filling meal that helped them get through the long days. For others, it was more of a survival food, something to keep your stomach from growling too loudly in the middle of a busy workday. Some say pottage was the original medieval fast food, quick, cheap, and easy to grab when you had little time or money. Others, however, couldn't stand it. In fact, it's rumored that pottage could get pretty boring after a while, with some of the poorer classes adding whatever ingredients they could find, making the flavor and the consistency anything but gourmet. Despite its humble beginnings, pottage served as a perfect example of how medieval street food was both functional and diverse. People could grab a bowl of pottage and continue with their day, or snack on bread and cheese as they worked. The beauty of medieval street food was in its simplicity. There was something for everyone, no matter their background or income. The cool part? Even though pottage might seem like the ultimate peasant dish, some versions of it were eaten by people across all social classes. Historians still debate whether it was more of a peasant's food or whether it was eaten by nobles on the go. But one thing's certain, pottage was everywhere. And let's face it, who could resist a comforting bowl of soup on a cold medieval day? So, if you were wandering the streets of a medieval town or city, you wouldn't have to look far for something to eat. Whether you were in the mood for something warm, savory, sweet, or just simple, street vendors had you covered. But what about the exotic flavors? Oh yes, the medieval world was opening its doors to a whole new world of food. The streets were alive with new flavors thanks to the ever-growing spice trade and the world's desire for something beyond the everyday. In our next section, we'll talk about how medieval street food vendors brought exotic spices and ingredients into the mix, making every bite a little more exciting. Hold on to your taste buds. Now imagine for a second, you've just grabbed a quick bite on the streets of medieval Europe. Maybe it's a hunk of bread slathered in butter or a chunk of roasted meat, but something's different today. There's a zing, a little kick to the flavor that wasn't there before. What's that? The addition of spices, exotic, colorful, and flavorful spices that were making their way from far-flung corners of the globe to the bustling medieval streets. Yes, folks, this is where medieval street food starts to get interesting. Spices in the medieval period weren't just used to make food taste good. They were status symbols, luxury items that indicated wealth and a refined palate. When you walked through a medieval marketplace, you might have caught a whiff of something far more fragrant than what you would have expected. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, these were all imports that started making their way into the hands of street food vendors. How, you ask? Well, let's take a journey into the spice trade and how it influenced the food culture of the Middle Ages. Let's start with saffron, which was one of the most prized spices of the medieval world. Imagine walking up to a vendor and being handed a simple bread roll or a bowl of pottage that's been topped with a dash of vibrant, golden saffron. That's right. Saffron could elevate a humble meal to something fit for royalty. It was highly sought after, and only the richest could afford it. The spice was so valuable that it was often used as a form of currency, or as a way to impress guests at feasts. Historians still argue whether saffron was used primarily for its flavor, or as a way to demonstrate wealth and status. Either way, it was the equivalent of putting gold leaf on your meal. When you had a dash of saffron sprinkled on your food, it wasn't just about taste, it was about showing off. For the street food vendors, offering dishes with a little bit of saffron or other spices could set them apart from the competition. It wasn't just about what you were selling, it was about how you were selling it. Another spice that made its way into the medieval street food scene was pepper, which was considered a must-have by the elite. In fact, pepper was so valuable that it was often referred to as black gold. The spice trade routes that brought pepper from the east became some of the most important in the medieval economy. It was so highly prized that pepper was often used to pay rents or even as a dowry during weddings. So, you might be wondering, what did pepper do for medieval street food? Well, the addition of pepper in sauces, pottage, or meats made for a spicier, more exotic flavor. It was a way for medieval vendors to transform simple foods into something more. A little pinch of pepper, and suddenly you had a dish with a bite to it, and maybe even a bit of prestige. But it wasn't just about pepper and saffron. The medieval world had access to a whole range of spices that we now take for granted. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, these spices were all available to the wealthy, and some even trickled down to street food vendors. Now, imagine walking past a street vendor who is offering you something that smells warm and comforting, with just a hint of sweetness. It's not just a regular bread or pastry, it's a sweet spice delight that could have had some cinnamon or nutmeg mixed into the dough, transforming an otherwise basic snack into a miniature exotic experience. Now, before we get too carried away, let's remember that spices weren't available to everyone. The common folk, especially peasants, couldn't afford the luxuries of saffron or expensive spices. For them, the spice trade was mostly out of reach. However, for those living in towns and cities where trade was thriving, access to these exotic ingredients slowly expanded. This meant that more and more medieval street food vendors were getting their hands on these flavors that could make their snacks stand out in the crowd. It wasn't just the spices that were exotic. Let's not forget about sugar, which was another luxury item that was slowly making its way into the hands of medieval street food vendors. While sugar was often used to preserve fruits or flavor cakes and pastries, it was still a relatively rare commodity in the medieval world. Still, street vendors who specialized in sweets or baked goods were starting to sprinkle it generously onto their creations, often using sugar to sweeten medieval versions of donuts, cakes, and pastries. The sugar trade was just getting started, and it would eventually transform the way people approached dessert in the centuries to come. But let's take a little detour because, as with anything shiny and new, not everyone thought that spices and sugar were all they were cracked up to be. Historians still argue whether all of these spices were actually good for health, given that many were used as preservatives for meats and other foods that weren't necessarily fresh. You see, medieval life wasn't all about gourmet meals. Food was often about survival, especially when it came to street food. Some of the meat served by street vendors could have been a little, let's say, questionable. After all, without refrigeration, how fresh could some of it really be? That's where the magic of spices came in, covering up odors and giving food a bit of extra oomph. Let's not forget about the medieval obsession with balance. And by balance, we mean medieval cuisine's focus on the four humors. You see, in medieval times, it was believed that health and food were all about balancing hot and cold, wet and dry. Spices like pepper and ginger were considered hot, making them perfect for winter months, while cooling spices like mint and coriander were popular in the hotter months. So, when you saw medieval vendors selling their latest dish, you might not just be paying for flavor, you were paying for your health and well-being, or at least a shot at it. As we continue on, we'll take a closer look at how these exotic spices and ingredients became integral to the vendor's success. But it wasn't just the spices that made street food unique. The vendors themselves were key players in the street food world, using charm and quick thinking to make sure their snacks weren't just good, they were memorable. Now that we've had a taste of the exotic influences on medieval street food, it's time to dive deeper into the vendors themselves. Just as today's food trucks and street food stalls often rely on personality and presentation, medieval vendors were no different. They were the entertainers, the performers, and the social glue that brought medieval marketplaces to life. When you think of a medieval street vendor, picture someone who wasn't just selling food, but creating an experience. The smell of roasting meats, the clink of coins exchanging hands, and the sizzle of bread or fish all contributed to the spectacle. But how did medieval vendors stand out in such a crowded market? It wasn't all about the food itself, it was also about how they sold it. Just like modern street food vendors, medieval sellers used a combination of showmanship, charm, and quick wit to attract customers. Imagine a vendor yelling, "Hot meat, fresh bread, get your lunch here," as you walked by. They might have even gone so far as to make their food appear larger than life, exaggerating the size of a roasted bird or the juiciness of a piece of meat. Some vendors even had theatrics to back up their pitch. If they were selling fish, for example, they might have put on a display where they expertly gutted and filleted a fish right there in front of the crowd, showing off their skills while enticing customers to come closer. Of course, social status played a major role in how street vendors were perceived. For a noble, the vendor's presentation was everything. While the wealthy might not have been directly purchasing their meals from street vendors, they were often influential in shaping the market scene. Vendors who catered to the nobility were expected to be well-spoken, neat, and professional, with food prepared to the highest standard. But the vendors serving the common folk had a bit more leeway when it came to their presentation. They didn't need to have the finest tablecloths or the fanciest attire. They just needed to make sure the food was affordable and tasty enough to attract attention. And speaking of presentation, let's talk about how medieval vendors marketed their food. This wasn't just about food labels or catchy slogans. Those didn't exist yet. Medieval street food vendors used signs, symbols, and even costume to communicate what they were selling. A street food stall that sold sausages might have had a sign with a sausage on it, while a fishmonger might hang a dried fish above their stall. The idea was to make the stall visually appealing and easy to identify, especially when competing for attention in a busy market. But it wasn't just visual appeal. Hearing a vendor's pitch was just as important as seeing their wares. Medieval marketplaces were loud and full of chatter, so a vendor had to make their voice heard over the din. You might hear them calling out in a sing-song voice, shouting out the price of their goods, or even offering samples to passersby to encourage them to try their products. It wasn't unusual for street vendors to attract crowds with a combination of food samples, charming conversation, and the occasional performative element, like singing or telling a story about the food they sold. This lively marketplace atmosphere, with its colorful personalities and noisy exchanges, was part of what made medieval street food so unique. The experience of purchasing food wasn't just about the meal, it was about the interaction with the vendor. Vendors who could charm their customers or engage them in conversation were more likely to gain repeat business. Food became a social event, and the streets were the stage. Now, while street food was often sold on the go, it wasn't always eaten in a hurry. In fact, some vendors catered to the busy traveler or merchant who had time to sit down and enjoy a meal. Street vendors often had a small, temporary seating area where customers could relax, eat, and chat. Imagine a bustling medieval market with wooden benches or crates where people could sit, enjoy a warm meal, and socialize after a long day. This wasn't a high-end dining experience, but it was a chance to take a break, enjoy a good meal, and catch up on the gossip of the day. But even in these moments of relaxation, the food had to be satisfying. Street food wasn't just about filling the belly. It had to be flavorful, hearty, and accessible. You could grab a bite of roasted meat, a bowl of pottage, or a simple piece of bread with cheese, depending on your mood and budget. And of course, in a time when food could be scarce, street food vendors often served as a lifeline for the working poor. Their stalls were a place where people could find a meal at any time of day, whether they were on their way to work or just needed a break from the grind of life. Despite the warm, welcoming atmosphere of medieval food stalls, not all was as it seemed. As we move into our next section, we'll take a more critical look at how street food sometimes crossed the line from convenience to a questionable health. What did the state of hygiene look like in these busy, crowded markets? Was street food always safe to eat? Trust me, this is where things start to get a little grim. Now that we've looked at the lively scene of medieval street food vendors, let's talk about something a little more unsettling. While the sights, sounds, and smells of the market were often enticing, the reality of hygiene and food safety in the medieval world was far from pretty. So, before you start picturing your perfect medieval snack, let's take a look at how the state of hygiene might have made you think twice before biting into that sizzling piece of meat. Medieval street food wasn't exactly known for its health standards. In fact, it was often a bit of a gamble whether the food you grabbed from a vendor was safe to eat. Let's just say medieval markets didn't exactly have health inspectors or food safety regulations like we do today. The idea of cleanliness in the medieval period was very different from what we expect now. In fact, people didn't even know about germs. The lack of understanding of hygiene in the medieval world meant that food wasn't always prepared under the cleanest conditions. In these open-air markets, food was exposed to the elements, which meant it was subject to all kinds of contaminants. Birds, rats, and even stray animals might have wandered through the market, sharing the same space as the food being sold. And we're not just talking about the occasional mouse nibbling on a loaf of bread. In fact, there were stories of vendors using old, questionable ingredients to stretch the life of their food, such as using stale bread or adding questionable meats to soups or stews. It wasn't uncommon for meat to be preserved with salt or smoke, but this didn't always guarantee it was fresh. In fact, many historians believe that medieval street food vendors might have used their tricks to hide the less than fresh food. The scent of spices might have been enough to cover up the stench of aged meat, or a thick sauce could mask the bitterness of rotting vegetables. But it didn't stop there. Meat vendors, who were often the stars of the medieval street food scene, faced a unique challenge, keeping their products fresh without modern refrigeration. So how did they do it? Well, often by salting, smoking, or drying their meat. These preservation techniques were incredibly important in keeping food from spoiling, but they didn't always guarantee the quality we'd expect today. Historians argue whether these meats were truly fresh or whether they were kept for far too long. It was a game of risk. If you were hungry enough, you took the chance. But if the food went bad, well, that could lead to some unpleasant consequences. Fish, on the other hand, was a whole different story. Fish, particularly in coastal areas, was an essential part of the medieval diet. And like meat, it had to be preserved somehow. Salted fish was a common option, especially during Lent when people couldn't eat meat. But just like with meat, the freshness of the fish was not always guaranteed. Vendors who specialized in fish often faced the challenge of selling their catch before it went bad, and there was no refrigeration to slow down the spoilage. Historians still argue whether the salty fish served in the markets was fresh, or if it was just a cleverly disguised product of preservation. Of course, it wasn't just the vendors who were trying to keep food fresh. It was the environment that posed a serious risk to the food's safety. Medieval streets were often dirty and overcrowded, with waste being thrown into the streets, creating a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and pests. Imagine walking down a street where human and animal waste were sometimes tossed directly into the gutters, and then seeing food being prepared right next to it. It's enough to make anyone rethink their snack choices. So, how did the people of medieval times deal with all this? Well, they didn't really have much of a choice. People ate what they could get, and while there were certainly foodborne illnesses that could be traced back to poor hygiene, it was the norm to have to take a gamble on the safety of your meal. That said, many of the poorer folk didn't have the luxury of being picky. If you were hungry and couldn't afford to eat at home, you would grab whatever food was available. There was no choice but to trust that the vendor had done their best to prepare a decent meal. This lack of choice might sound horrifying to us today, but for the common medieval person, it was part of the grind. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Food preservation methods in the Middle Ages, while imperfect, did help ensure that people didn't starve to death. Vendors who specialized in pickling, salting, and fermenting their food were able to offer snacks that lasted for days, even weeks. And let's not forget that while food safety might have been questionable, people still survived. In fact, medieval street food, despite the risks, was often one of the most reliable sources of nutrition for the common people. Now that we've taken a look at the grittier side of medieval street food, let's lighten the mood a bit. Sure, there were health risks, but there were also moments of indulgence. Sweet treats and seasonal delights that made life a little bit sweeter. So, in the next section, we'll dive into some of the more delightful aspects of medieval street food, where food was about more than just survival, it was about enjoyment and celebration. Alright, now that we've taken a deep dive into the sometimes grim reality of medieval street food, let's take a step back and enjoy the sweeter side of things. You might have expected the medieval streets to be nothing but grimy meat skewers and questionable pottage, but let's not forget that every now and then, a little indulgence was in order. Yes, there were moments when medieval street food became a treat, something to bring joy and sweetness to an otherwise hard day. Let's start with one of the most delightful elements of medieval street food: fruits and nuts. Imagine walking through a busy market square and spotting a vendor selling a variety of freshly picked fruits: apples, pears, berries, and even figs. These fruits weren't just delicious snacks, they were seasonal treasures. Depending on the time of year, you could find different varieties of fruits lining the stalls, brightening up the marketplace with their colors and scents. Historians still argue about the extent to which certain fruits were available to peasants, but what's clear is that fruits like apples and pears were enjoyed by all classes, especially when they were in season. Vendors would often sell them in small baskets, and they'd be easy to grab on the go, perfect for a quick bite between errands or during a busy day of work. The fun didn't stop there. Nuts were another popular snack. They were often roasted and salted, making them perfect for munching as you walked through the market. Walnuts, hazelnuts, and almonds were common, and they were both nutritious and flavorful. A handful of roasted nuts could keep you going during a busy day, or they could be the perfect treat after a long day of work. They were easy to transport and could be eaten without any fuss. Just crack open the shell and enjoy the crunchy, salty goodness. But let's not forget the real sweet treats of medieval street food. After all, while the common folk didn't have access to modern candy bars or pastries, there were still ways to indulge in something sugary. One of the most common sweet snacks available was honey. Honey was used not just as a sweetener for drinks and foods, but also as a treat all on its own. Street vendors would sell chunks of honeycomb, dripping with golden sweetness perfect for nibbling. This was no ordinary snack. Honey was an expensive delicacy enjoyed by all classes. For the working class, it was a luxury that could brighten up an otherwise plain meal. For the nobility, honey was a way to sweeten dishes and show off their wealth. It was often paired with fruits, nuts, or even used to glaze meats, giving those medieval meals a little extra sparkle. And let's not forget about sugary pastries. While the cakes and sweets of the medieval world weren't quite like what we think of today, there were still medieval versions of pastries that were baked in street-side ovens. Vendors would bake dough-based treats, sometimes filled with sweetened fruits or nuts, and serve them piping hot. These weren't exactly the flaky, buttery pastries you'd find in modern bakeries, but they were a real treat for medieval people. Historians have uncovered recipes for medieval pastries that were filled with a variety of sweet and savory ingredients, from spiced apples to sugared almonds. One particularly delightful snack was fried dough, which, though not quite the same as modern-day donuts, was a sweet, deep-fried treat that became quite popular in medieval markets. Fried dough was often coated with sugar, making it a crispy, sugary indulgence that anyone could enjoy. Imagine biting into a hot, sweet piece of fried dough, with the sugar crystallizing on your tongue as you walk through the bustling marketplace. It's the kind of snack that could turn a bad day into a good one. Simple, yet so satisfying. But what about those special festival foods? Medieval festivals were a time of celebration, and the street food during these events could be a bit more extravagant. At fairs, feasts, and public holidays, vendors often went all out, offering foods that were a bit more indulgent than the usual bread and cheese. Roasted meats were still common, but vendors would also offer sweetmeats, pies, and even fried pastries with fruit fillings. These festival foods were not just for the peasants. They were meant for everyone to enjoy, from the common folk to the nobility. During these times, food became a shared experience, where people could indulge in treats they wouldn't normally have access to, or at least not as regularly. Now, while these sweet treats were indeed a highlight for many, they weren't always easy to get. As we mentioned earlier, the availability of luxury ingredients like honey, sugar, and fruit was often tied to social class. Nobles and wealthy merchants could afford to indulge in these sweets, while the common folk had to make do with whatever they could find in the marketplace. But even for those living on a tighter budget, there were still ways to satisfy a sweet tooth. A little bit of honey or some roasted nuts could go a long way in lifting one's spirits after a long day. Of course, not everyone could afford the sweets and indulgent snacks of the upper classes, but the joy of these simple pleasures in the medieval world wasn't just about the food itself. It was about celebrating life in the moment. The ability to walk down the market street, enjoy a little sweetness, and take a break from the hardships of daily life. Whether it was a handful of nuts, a chunk of honeycomb, or a warm pastry, these treats added a little bit of brightness to the often grim realities of medieval life. So, now that we've indulged a bit and taken a peek at the sweet side of medieval street food, let's take a breather and look at how street food impacted the social and economic fabric of medieval society. How did these simple snacks shape the way people lived, worked, and socialized in the medieval period? Let's explore that in the next section. Now that we've enjoyed a little sweetness from the medieval streets, let's turn our attention to the bigger picture: how street food shaped medieval society. It's easy to think of food as just something we eat to fill our stomachs, but in the medieval world, food was so much more than that. It was a social glue, a status symbol, and for many, a lifeline. Whether it was a quick snack between work shifts or an indulgent treat during a festival, street food wasn't just about nourishment. It was about community, social status, and identity. First off, let's talk about social classes and how street food functioned as a marker of status. If you were a noble, you probably wouldn't be strolling through a crowded medieval market looking for a snack from a street vendor. Nobles had their own elaborate feasts and private kitchens, often enjoying meals with the finest ingredients available. But that doesn't mean street food didn't influence them. The presence of street food vendors in the marketplace was a constant reminder of the social divide. While the nobility enjoyed their grand banquets, the rest of the population was making do with what they could afford: bread, pottage, and the occasional roasted meat. But just because street food was primarily for the common folk doesn't mean the upper classes were completely disconnected from it. Historians argue whether the nobility ever partook in street food, or if they simply watched the hustle and bustle of the market from the safety of their homes. Some even believe that nobles would occasionally sneak out for a taste of something simple, craving the authenticity and excitement of street snacks away from their polished, structured feasts. The occasional visit to the market wasn't just about food. It was about experiencing the pulse of the city and connecting with the real world outside of castles and mansions. For the working class, street food was often the only option for a quick meal during the day. If you were a farmer, blacksmith, or merchant, you didn't have the luxury of sitting down to a multi-course meal at home. You needed something to fuel you through the day, something hearty, filling, and portable. Street food vendors served this need perfectly. Whether you grabbed a chunk of bread with cheese, a hunk of roasted meat, or a simple bowl of pottage, these quick bites helped people stay energized and keep working. And since they were sold at reasonable prices, these meals were accessible to most, making them a crucial part of daily life. In some ways, the street food vendors were the unsung heroes of medieval cities. Without them, the working class would have struggled to find affordable, nourishing meals. Vendors who sold cheap but filling food helped ensure that the labor force didn't go hungry. The economy was dependent on these vendors, and they helped keep cities running smoothly. It's easy to imagine how much chaos there would have been if workers couldn't find a quick, affordable meal. They wouldn't have the energy to do their jobs, and that would throw the whole economy into disarray. But it wasn't just about food. The street food vendors played a crucial role in the social fabric of medieval towns. Picture yourself walking through a medieval marketplace, surrounded by the sounds of vendors calling out their wares, people chatting, and children running through the streets. The food was just one part of this lively scene. The vendors themselves were part of the community, and their stalls were often the centers of social interaction. People gathered around the food stalls not only to grab a quick bite, but also to exchange news, gossip, and sometimes even to strike a deal. The market was a place where the working class could connect with each other, share stories, and catch up on the latest happenings. Food became a catalyst for conversation and community building, and the vendors were the ones keeping the conversation going. The vendors themselves were often the stars of the show. Whether they were shouting out their prices, sharing a funny story, or offering samples to passers-by, these vendors had to be charismatic and engaging to succeed. Think of them as the social hubs of the marketplace. A well-loved vendor could have a regular following, with customers returning time and time again for their signature snacks. And if a vendor was particularly skilled at entertaining or charming their customers, they could build a loyal customer base that ensured their success. But street food wasn't just about fueling the labor force or providing a quick bite during the day. It was also about pleasure. Medieval street food wasn't all functional. It was also a way to enjoy life, have fun, and celebrate. Festivals, fairs, and public events were the times when street food vendors could really shine. These events allowed vendors to showcase their culinary skills, serving up dishes that were more indulgent and extravagant than the everyday fare. Roasted meats, sweet pastries, and other treats became the centerpiece of these celebrations, and food was often just as important as the festivities themselves. The street food vendors were as much part of the festival experience as the music, dancing, and games. It wasn't just the vendors and the working class who enjoyed these festivals. The royalty and nobility sometimes attended these celebrations too, albeit from a distance. Some even argued that they enjoyed watching the festivities from the sidelines, admiring the common people's ingenuity and the diversity of food on offer. But no matter who attended, these festivals highlighted how food could bring people together. It didn't matter whether you were a noble or a peasant. Everyone could partake in the joy of the feast. The street food vendors helped create an environment where food, culture, and community all came together in a celebration of life, however simple or lavish. As we move on, let's explore how medieval street food made its way into more specialized culinary traditions, shaping the food culture we know today. But before we do, take a moment to appreciate how these vendors were more than just food sellers. They were key players in the social, economic, and cultural life of medieval cities. Street food wasn't just about eating, it was about community, status, and identity. And the vendors were the ones who made sure it all happened. As we continue our journey through the medieval street food world, we come to an interesting crossroads: the specialization of certain street food vendors. While many vendors sold a variety of snacks, others honed their craft, offering a more specific signature dish that could elevate them from simple food sellers to masters of their craft. The specialization of street food in the Middle Ages was more than just a way to stand out in a crowded market. It was about creating a unique identity and offering something that couldn't easily be found anywhere else. It's a bit like today's food trucks that serve up one specialty dish with a twist, but with far more medieval flair. One of the most common specialized vendors in medieval markets was the pie maker. These vendors were often responsible for creating some of the most indulgent, savory, and sometimes bizarre street food offerings. Medieval pies weren't the sweet, flaky pastries we know today. They were often hearty, meat-filled dishes that could be eaten on the go. Imagine walking through a busy street market, and a vendor hands you a steaming, fragrant meat pie wrapped in a pastry crust. This wasn't just any pie. It could be filled with a variety of meats, such as beef, lamb, or even wild game, and seasoned with spices that were rare and expensive, giving it an extra layer of luxury. These pies weren't just food. They were a way to demonstrate the creativity and skill of the vendor. The meat pie was versatile, offering a filling meal that could easily be eaten on the move or saved for later. It also served as a sort of portable feast, something that was particularly useful for travelers, soldiers, or anyone who needed a hearty meal in a compact, convenient form. The pie makers of medieval markets were the ones perfecting the art of fast food, long before we ever thought to put a burger in a wrapper. Their specialty was taking what seemed like ordinary ingredients and elevating them into something memorable. Another interesting group of specialized vendors was the fishmongers. Fish was a huge part of the medieval diet, especially in coastal areas. But the fishmongers weren't just selling any old fish. These vendors were masters of preservation, selling salted, pickled, or dried fish that could last for months without spoiling. Fish was a common food source, particularly during religious periods like Lent, when meat was forbidden. Fishmongers took full advantage of the demand during these times, offering a range of fish options from fresh catches to the preserved variety. Interestingly, fishmongers often served their goods with a touch of flair. They weren't just selling fish, they were selling an experience. For example, you might walk up to a fish vendor and see them filleting a fish right in front of you, the sharp knife cutting through the glistening flesh, offering you a taste of the freshest fish around. In the bustling medieval market, where food was often seen as just fuel, the fishmongers knew how to turn their products into a spectacle, making the simple act of buying fish a memorable one. Speaking of specialization, let's not forget about the vendors who catered to sweet cravings. As we've already touched on, honey and nuts were popular treats, but there were also vendors who specialized in sugar-based sweets. Street-side candied fruits, sweet pastries, and even spiced honey cakes became the go-to snacks for those looking for something a bit sweeter. These sweets weren't as common as the savory dishes, but they still played an important role in medieval street food culture. Vendors would often infuse pastries with spices, giving them a unique flavor profile that combined the sweetness of sugar with the heat of cinnamon or nutmeg. These sweet creations were often sold as indulgent treats during festivals, feasts, or public holidays. But there was also something a little more exotic about some of these specialized sweets. Medieval sugar wasn't as refined as what we use today. It was more like raw sugar or sugar syrup, and it could be used in combination with spices and herbs to create one-of-a-kind street snacks. Imagine biting into a warm pastry filled with spiced fruit, the sugar lightly melting on your tongue. It wasn't just a snack, it was an experience that you couldn't find anywhere else. The demand for these specialized treats grew, especially among those who had a bit more to spend, but they were available to all when the streets came alive during festivals. Now, we can't talk about specialized vendors without mentioning the rise of the brewmasters in the medieval street food scene. While we think of beer and ale today as staple drinks at pubs or bars, in the medieval world, ale was a common part of the street food experience. Ale vendors sold their brews directly from barrels, offering a refreshing drink that complemented the hearty, salty foods that were so common in medieval marketplaces. Ale was the go-to drink for people of all classes, and brewers who specialized in crafting beer or ale were often well respected in their communities. Historians still debate whether medieval ale was stronger or weaker than the beer we drink today, but one thing's for sure, it was an integral part of the social scene. Whether it was a rich dark ale or a light frothy brew, vendors would often have their ale served in wooden mugs or cups, and you could drink it while walking around the market, chatting with friends or trading with neighbors. Ale was not just a drink, it was part of the fabric of medieval life, and these brewers and ale vendors were essential to the marketplace's thriving social atmosphere. So, as you can see, specialized vendors weren't just selling food, they were offering an experience. Whether they were crafting the perfect meat pie, filleting fresh fish, or brewing the best ale in town, these vendors brought their craft to life in ways that made their stalls stand out in a crowded marketplace. Street food wasn't just about survival, it was about indulgence, creativity, and specialization. And these vendors, with their unique offerings and creative twists on the basics, helped shape the food culture of medieval cities, creating a legacy of culinary craftsmanship that would live on in later generations. As we move forward, we'll explore the changing tastes of medieval society and how these early street food traditions influenced what we eat today. We'll also take a look at some of the more unusual and quirky street foods that made their way into the medieval diet. Prepare for a few surprises, and don't worry, no more grim health talks for now. But as much as these medieval snacks would eventually influence modern culinary culture, they also reflect how the changing social and economic structures of the medieval world impacted what people ate. For example, as towns and cities grew, trade expanded, and with it, access to new ingredients and flavors. Exotic spices from the East were once rare and expensive, but gradually became more accessible, allowing street food vendors to introduce new tastes and twists to traditional recipes. The spice trade had a major influence on how medieval food evolved, and it marked the beginning of a global exchange of culinary ideas. So, what were some of the more unusual medieval street foods that made their way into the history books and that might surprise you? While we've already touched on some of the quirky medieval dishes like peas pudding, There were others that were far more unusual and, frankly, strange by modern standards. Historians still debate whether some of these foods were truly enjoyed by people or whether they were the subject of medieval satire. Regardless, they made their mark on medieval culinary history. One such dish was black pudding, a type of blood sausage made with pork blood, oats, and spices. While not quite the street snack we might think of today, black pudding was a street food that could be found in various medieval markets. The popularity of black pudding likely stemmed from the fact that it was both inexpensive and nutritious. Vendors who specialized in black pudding would often serve it hot, sometimes fried, and it could be eaten on the go, much like any other street food. Its reputation as a quirky medieval food has persisted over the years, and variations of blood pudding can still be found today, especially in European markets. Another strange but popular dish was stewed tripe, the lining of an animal's stomach, often served in a thick, hearty broth. Tripe was one of those foods that was a staple for the poor because it was cheap and filling, but it wasn't for everyone. Vendors selling tripe would often stew it in various spices, and it was often served with bread, making it a filling, if somewhat off-putting snack. Today, tripe is still enjoyed in some cultures, but it's not as common in street food scenes unless you're in a particularly adventurous culinary spot. Then there's the oddity of haggis, a dish made from sheep's offal, internal organs, mixed with oats and spices, and cooked inside the animal's stomach. While it may seem like a strange dish today, haggis has roots in medieval Scotland, and was commonly found in markets in the British Isles. This food was certainly an acquired taste, but it exemplified how medieval street food vendors could take the most basic, overlooked ingredients and turn them into a hearty, flavorful meal that helped sustain people through long, hard days. And who could forget about the medieval obsession with spiced wine or mead? These drinks were often sold by street vendors and could be served hot or cold, depending on the season. Mead, which is fermented honey, was a popular drink in both medieval Europe and the Nordic countries. It was considered an indulgence, particularly among nobles, but vendors often sold it at market fairs, offering a sweet, intoxicating treat for the working class. It's safe to say that the street food vendors of the medieval world didn't just focus on solid snacks. They knew how to keep their customers hydrated with creative drinks too. As we wrap up this section, it's clear that medieval street food was more than just a means of survival. It was a reflection of the world around it, a blend of practicality, creativity, and social interaction. The evolution of these street foods shows how important they were to medieval culture and how the seeds of modern street food were planted all those centuries ago. What's even more fascinating is that some of these medieval snacks, like pies, sausages, and street-side treats, continue to be enjoyed in various forms in street food scenes around the world today. In our next section, we'll slow things down a bit, reflect on the lasting legacy of medieval street food, and wind our journey to a close. So, grab your favorite snack, sit back, and let's ease into the end of this story together. As we wind down our exploration of medieval street food, it's time to reflect on the lasting legacy of these early snacks and what they've left behind for us. From the humble bread and cheese to the complex pies and roasted meats, medieval street food laid the foundation for the street food culture we know today. But how exactly did these medieval snacks evolve into the trendy, globally loved street food we indulge in now? Well, it's a story of cultural exchange, innovation, and an enduring love for food that can be enjoyed on the go. First off, we can't ignore the role of food preservation in shaping the future of street food. In medieval times, preservation techniques like salting, pickling, and smoking were essential for keeping food edible. These early methods not only ensured food lasted through the colder months, but also paved the way for the development of portable, convenient snacks. Whether it was dried fish, salted meats, or roasted nuts, these preserved foods were the ancestors of modern-day snack foods that are just as easy to pack and take on the go. Think about jerky or trail mix today. Those ancient practices of preserving food through smoking and salting are still alive and kicking in the food we eat. In the centuries following the Middle Ages, as cities and trade routes expanded, so did the availability of ingredients and the diversity of street food offerings. The spice trade, which we've touched on throughout our journey, became a vital force in shaping the future of street food. The introduction of spices from India, the Middle East, and Africa brought entirely new flavor profiles to medieval cooking, and that trend continued into the Renaissance and beyond. Modern street food is full of bold, global flavors, often incorporating spices and herbs that were once considered exotic. Without the medieval spice trade, we might not have tacos, curries, or falafel, all dishes that became famous street foods around the world. Let's not forget that the rise of the marketplace was one of the key factors that made street food so popular in medieval times. The marketplace was a hub of social life, where people came together to share food, news, and even gossip. In many ways, modern-day food markets and festivals are the direct descendants of those medieval gatherings. Whether it's food festivals, local markets, or food trucks that line the streets of modern cities, these spaces continue to serve as social gathering points, where food brings people together and offers them a sense of community. Now, looking at modern-day street food, it's clear that medieval vendors' creativity and ability to adapt to their environment paved the way for the modern street food scene. Take the concept of street food trucks. They're modern innovations, but they carry the same spirit of medieval street food vendors who had to make the most out of limited space, resources, and time. Whether it's a taco truck in Los Angeles, a crepe stand in Paris, or a fish and chips cart in London, today's street food vendors are still using the same principles as their medieval predecessors. Make it quick, make it tasty, and make it something people will come back for. And then there's the globalization of street food. Thanks to travel, the internet, and the merging of food cultures, today's street food scene is an eclectic mix of influences from all over the world. Think about the way Asian street foods like dumplings, satay, or bubble tea have taken over streets around the globe. They're beloved by millions, and yet these foods share many common threads with medieval snacks: portable, flavorful, and often cheap. Just like medieval street vendors who mixed local ingredients with exotic spices, today's street food vendors do the same, blending traditional flavors with modern twists, creating something fresh and exciting. But no matter how much the world has changed, one thing remains constant: the appeal of food that's quick, affordable, and satisfying. This is the core of street food, whether in medieval towns or modern cities. Street food is the original fast food, offering something that satisfies our cravings while fitting into the rhythm of our busy lives. Whether we're eating a medieval-style roasted meat on a stick or grabbing a gourmet taco from a food truck, the basic principles remain the same: food that's accessible, quick, and delicious. As we come to the end of our journey through medieval street food, let's take a moment to appreciate how these humble snacks, once limited to the bustling streets of medieval cities, have shaped what we eat today. Street food, both then and now, has always been about connection, a way for people to share a meal, a moment, and a story with those around them. Whether we're grabbing a quick bite in the city or enjoying an exotic street food festival abroad, we're continuing the age-old tradition of connecting with our communities over a shared love of good food. And as we wrap things up, it's time to reflect on how far we've come, and how little has changed when it comes to the joy of enjoying a meal on the go. Whether you're sitting at a table in a medieval marketplace or standing on a busy street corner today, the excitement of trying something new, sampling flavors from all over the world, and bonding with those around you over food has endured through the centuries. So now that our journey through medieval street food has come to a close, I'll leave you with this. Next time you grab a snack on the go, whether it's a classic hot dog or a flavorful dumpling, take a moment to appreciate the centuries of culinary history that led to that very bite. The medieval street food vendors may be long gone, but their legacy lives on in every bite we take. As we ease into the final stretch of our journey through the streets of the medieval world, let's take a moment to reflect on something a little more profound. The legacy of a medieval street food and how it transcended its humble beginnings to influence the way we think about food, culture, and even society today. We've explored the bustling medieval markets, the rise of food vendors, the humble street snacks, and the exotic spices that shape the culinary landscape. But what was the lasting impact of medieval street food? What made it so special, and why is it still so relevant centuries later? One thing is clear: street food was and still is more than just food. It was about connection, community, and a way of life that has echoed down through history. Think about it. The street food vendors were the unsung heroes of the medieval world, serving not just meals but also acting as social hubs. Medieval street food was the pulse of the city. It brought people together, offering a brief respite from the grind of daily life and creating a space for conversation, gossip, and connection. We can see this in modern street food culture today, where food is not just a meal but a shared experience, a way to build community and create memories. And let's not forget how medieval street food made a big impact on the evolution of global cuisines. When we look at street food today, it's not just about one specific cuisine or culture. It's a mashup of flavors from all over the world. The influence of medieval trade, the exchange of spices, and the melting pot of cultures that evolved in European cities shaped the street food culture we know now. From the spices of the East to the heartiness of European fare, medieval street food was an early precursor to the diverse street food scene we enjoy today. The blending of flavors, the push to use fresh, local ingredients, and the desire to make food that's both delicious and accessible, that all traces back to the medieval street food vendors. What makes medieval street food particularly fascinating is how it reflects the everyday lives of people. Unlike the grand feasts of royalty, the medieval street food scene was about food for the people. It was simple, practical, and quick, designed to fit into the fast-paced, labor-intensive world that many people lived in. Today, we're seeing a resurgence of the desire for quick, tasty, and satisfying meals that don't require a lot of time or effort. This desire for convenience, but still with flavor and quality, is what makes street food so timeless. It's the perfect balance of practicality and indulgence, something we can all relate to, no matter our background or social status. As the world moved into the Renaissance and beyond, the idea of street food as a way of life never really disappeared. In fact, the spirit of medieval street food continued to shape culinary traditions for generations to come. Street food vendors in later centuries adopted many of the same techniques and ideas that medieval vendors used to create their iconic snacks. The use of spices, the skill of preservation, and the art of making something out of simple ingredients were all carried forward. The idea that food could be quickly prepared, portable, and inexpensive became foundational for the way we approach fast food today. So much of what we eat on the go, whether it's a sandwich, a taco, or a gyro, can trace its origins back to the medieval vendors who understood the importance of convenience, flavor, and accessibility. In the modern world, street food has experienced a revival in many urban centers around the world. With the rise of food trucks, street food festivals, and pop-up stalls, we are seeing a return to the values that medieval street food represented. It's not just about feeding people quickly. It's about creating a community around food, celebrating culture through what we eat, and honoring the craftsmanship of the vendor who prepares it. Whether you're in New York, Bangkok, or Istanbul, street food remains an essential part of the social fabric of cities, much like it was in medieval times. But perhaps the most significant legacy of medieval street food lies in the shared enjoyment that comes from eating it. Just like the medieval street vendors were part of the fabric of the marketplace, today's vendors continue to play a role in shaping the rhythm of our cities. Street food offers a moment of connection, whether it's sharing a quick bite with friends, gathering around a food truck after work, or enjoying a meal on the streets with strangers who might become friends. It's about sharing in the experience of food, a simple yet profound pleasure that transcends time, culture, and geography. As we close this chapter, it's impossible to ignore how much medieval street food has shaped our culinary world. From the rise of the first public markets to the diverse global street food scene we enjoy today, the roots of street food are deeply embedded in the medieval period. It's a testament to the creativity, resourcefulness, and connection that food offers no matter the century. Now, as we wrap up our journey through the medieval streets, take a moment to appreciate the snacks you enjoy today and how much history they carry with them. Whether you're nibbling on a piece of street pizza in Rome, grabbing a taco in Mexico City, or enjoying a crepe in Paris, remember that the medieval street food vendors were there long before, shaping the future of fast, flavorful food. And with that, our journey has come to an end. As we leave the medieval streets behind, let's remember that the next time we grab something to eat from a food truck or a street vendor, we're not just satisfying our hunger. We're continuing an age-old tradition that connects us to centuries of culinary history. Now take a deep breath, relax, and reflect on the history we've uncovered tonight. Sweet dreams, and until next time.